The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar, Content Strategy for Early Stage Startups, presented by Early Growth Financial Services and InterimCMO. My name is Amanda Young and I'll be your moderator from the Early Growth team. I just have a couple quick notes before we get started today, and actually the first thing I'd like to do is a quick poll to get a feel for everybody's current content marketing strategy for their company. So if you could go ahead and respond to this poll, that would be great. Give us a better idea of what we need to get into today. So I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll. So if everybody can go ahead and respond to that, I will go over a couple other things about the webinar while you guys work on that. So today's webinar will last about 60 minutes, including some time for a Q&A at the end. But we'll also take questions as we go, so feel free to answer questions or ask questions, throughout the presentation on your toolbar. The next thing to note is that this webinar is going to be recorded, and we will send the recording to everybody within 48 hours, so you'll have access to that and the deck as well after the presentation. You can also find this recording and all of our other recordings on our YouTube channel, Early Growth. We've done a bunch of cool webinars this year, so you can go in there and re-listen to them to get more information on many topics. So looks like we've got a pretty good response to this poll. So I'm going to go ahead and close this one, and if you answered yes, I would like to get a little bit better idea of how sophisticated your current system is. So we have 57% yes right now. So I'm going to close this poll and ask you guys how functional or sophisticated your content marketing strategy is. And if you can go ahead and choose on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being the most sophisticated, that would be great so that we can go ahead and figure out how tailored we need this talk to be, because Megan can make it a little bit more intro, or she can make it more sophisticated if needed. So thank you for that. So I'd like to just introduce Early Growth a little bit. To start out, Early Growth is an outsourced financial services firm, and we provide early stage companies with financial services from accounting to CFO consulting to taxes and valuations. And we actually just started a fund accounting practice, which is super exciting. Next page is a quote from our founder, David Ehrenberg, and a couple of the companies we've worked with. So looks like we have a good response on the second poll as well. So I'm going to go ahead and share that with Megan. Actually, there's only 70% who voted. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that open for a little bit longer. But Megan, it looks like it's between 1 and 3. 33% say their sophistication is a level 3. So probably more of an intro to content marketing, which should be good, especially since 50% said they didn't have any happening right now. So I'd like to introduce Megan now. Megan is the founder of InterimCMO, and EGFS and InterimCMO provide complementary services for a similar client base in the startup space. So we work a lot together with similar clients. InterimCMO is an extension of your core team that drives your startup, your investment, and your brand through the initial and transitional phases. They work exclusively with high-growth tech companies on brand positioning, content marketing, sales enablement, and fundraising and acquisitions. And they give founders strategic guidance, build and train junior teams, or simply execute on marketing for companies in the interim. So now I'd like to pass it off to Megan to talk to us about content marketing.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Amanda. Hi, everyone. Great to be here. I'm not seeing your screen. I'm not sure if anybody else is having the same issue, or I should say the screen is stuck on the poll. Just make sure we're squared away before I get started.
Okay, are we back?
There we go.
Awesome.
Yes, great. Okay, cool. So a little bit about me. Oops, there's the poll. Okay, great. There we go, perfect. A little bit about me and my background and why I'm qualified to talk about content marketing. So I spent about 15 years in the content marketing space. I kind of cut my teeth working with Kissmetrics, doing content strategy. And Kissmetrics, I don't know if anyone here is familiar with them, but they were kind of the original, the old school content strategy gurus, so to speak. They had a really incredible blog that people followed for years, and a lot of the material that they talked about and a lot of the techniques that they used around content marketing really set the stage for a lot of what other young companies did. So that was a really great experience. Later, I went on to head up marketing at VentureBeat. I also spent 5 years working with major publishers and ad tech companies such as HuffPost, did some work with Adweek, founded the analytics practice at Federated Media. And alongside those, I've been very active in the startup space. So I've been a mentor at Techstars for the last 4 or 5 years, also at Highway 1, which is a hardware accelerator since the beginning, and of course through InterimCMO. And what this means and why I think this is relevant is that content marketing then can be looked at as both something that we draw from the big brands and the big agencies and the big news publications, and also something that we offer to small companies and to startups. So working alongside a lot of these early stage companies, I've really gotten to see some of the struggles that they've had and have helped been able to support their thinking in getting started. And that means that, you know, of course, I'm familiar with what it's like to have very few resources to content marketing, and hopefully I can kind of get you guys started in the right direction. So next slide, please. Great. So content marketing can be really overwhelming for startups, also for established companies, but it doesn't have to be. So like I mentioned, I meet with a lot of founders and early teams who have, you know, let's say 200 Twitter followers, 20 blog posts, and potentially 10 views each. And it doesn't really do anything for them. I also have worked with a lot of really large brands. Of course, Huffington Post has had a really great partnership through the Partner Studio with several Fortune 500 brands. So I've kind of seen content marketing get executed in a variety of different ways and with a variety of different budgets. So, you know, the main takeaway from my experience that I can share with you is don't try to be a Fortune 500 content marketer. So you probably don't have the resources if you're an early stage company and an early team, but do be strategic. And we're about to go through how to approach that. Next slide, please. So I'm a firm believer that there are really only 7 key things you need to know to be a successful content marketer. There's certainly a lot of hype around content marketing, and it can seem pretty mysterious, but there are really only 7 core pieces to a content marketing strategy that you need to think of. So I'm going to go through each one of these in detail. In summary, though, you want to pick your audience, identify the channels where they live, make sure that you're selecting the right topics to talk about. Then you need to actually produce your content. Then think about how you're going to get that out to the world. So that's priming it, distributing it, getting some leverage for it, and then, of course, testing and learning and measuring the performance of those posts. Next slide, please. So step 1, know your audience. If you don't know what motivates your customer, if you don't know how to find them, and if you're not sure what resonates with them, you simply can't sell to them. So it's a fairly basic concept, but most of us decide to dive into our content marketing strategy without putting some thought into that initial evaluation and trying to understand who we're really speaking to. So if we can jump to the next slide, the core thing to know about this, I don't know if anybody spent time in the corporate space, but in several large companies, there's a lot of emphasis on creating personas, and personas are basically stereotypes that help you understand what your audience needs, wants, and avoids. So even though it is kind of a corporate approach, there's actually a lot of truth underneath it. And what we're really trying to do is move beyond thinking of our persona or our audience, which is actually kind of a cold, impersonal way of evaluating who we're trying to speak to. And thinking of them like that actually removes our ability to help us approach our readers and think through them as people instead of just customers. And so what we're trying to do here is realize there are people just like you and me who have preferences about what they read, who have preferences about what they watch, but then also in real life, of course, what they like to do and how they spend their time and how they spend their money. So once you kind of start to understand who you're producing content for, then you've unlocked the door to making a bunch of decisions down the road that impact how successful your content is. So let's jump to the next slide. Many of us have started to think about our audience on a pretty superficial level. So if you've ever done any ad targeting, these attributes are familiar because they're parameters that you'd put into a campaign to appropriately target. However, for this exercise, I want you to go one layer deeper and start to think about what motivates your stereotypical or your ideal audience. So that means let's look at their behaviors. How do they spend their money? How do they relate with technology? What kinds of sites are they spending their time on? How do they interact with social media? What are their browsing habits? Are they early adopters? Do they have a high risk tolerance? These are the types of things that you want to think through when you're developing your content strategy. For one, because it tells you potential resonance for your product or your topic. But for two, it actually helps you be more specific and targeted about the content that you're creating. So thinking more beyond this, let's jump to slide number 3. And what I say here is it's important to come up with 2 to 3 fictitious characters who could actually exist, their personas, their symbols for how you would start to target your content. But the first character is actually going to be your dominant persona and the one that you target a product launch around or that you target your content launch around. And this is this persona that's going to guide a lot of your thinking in terms of the material that you're producing. The other 2 characters are potentially secondary. They're additional personas that you can target to once you've started to develop resonance with your first group. And again, these fictitious characters are symbols in your mind that help you stay connected to who you're producing content for and why you're producing it. So it's important to keep these in your mind. And I really recommend taking the time to do this before you launch into the rest of your content marketing plan. Just like you know who you're about to meet with at an in-person meeting, you might do a little bit of background research on them, understand how they're using technology, what kinds of profession and engagements they have, what kinds of activities they spend their time on. Just like you do background research for an in-person meeting, do the same type of research for who your customer is going to be. And your customer likely is going to be, your first customer is going to be this first persona here. It doesn't mean that you can only have one customer, but you really want to narrow it down to one user group. And so the problem with that is that if you try and spread yourself too thin, and if you try and tailor your content to all 3 at once, you'll actually risk diluting your message, you'll dilute your channels, and you'll also dilute your results. So map out 3 and pick one to move forward with first. Next slide, please. Once you understand who your customers or who your audience is, the next important thing is to understand where they live online. So what are your personas most likely to be exposed to your content? Where are they when they're exposed to your content? What are they doing? Is it a business decision maker who is thumbing through a deck that can be reviewed on an airplane? And maybe that deck came through a direct lead and they had gone to your site, downloaded a white paper, your sales team started to engage with them and sent them a follow-up deck. This is also part of content strategy. Is it an article that somebody's reading on the subway? Or is it a 1-minute video that somebody's watching while they're getting dressed and ready to go out on a Friday night? These are how you want to approach thinking about the channels that you're posting your content and even the types of content you're producing and the moments in which your prospect is most receptive to your content marketing message. Next slide, please. Great. So the first idea here is, again, being selective and being consistent. Don't try to be everywhere. I meet with a lot of founders who have decided to launch their content marketing on 7, 8, 9 different channels. They've got email marketing, they've got Snapchat, Instagram, Pinterest, Facebook, et cetera, and it's really hard for them to produce fresh, unique content on all those channels in a compelling way. they often end up cross-posting a lot of that content, and it kind of gets stale. So typically it's best to grab all those handles so that nobody else does. They're yours, you own them. And so later, once you start to get that resonance and start to build up a greater following, you can think about expanding into other platforms. But for when you're first starting out, if you don't have any content marketing strategy, be selective, figure out what 2 to 3 channels work the best with your message that underscore your goals and that are most likely to reach and appeal to the people that you're targeting. So isolate your variables. Definitely, and we'll cover this later, when you start to originally publish your content, you want to be looking at the metrics, and those metrics will be validating whether you've nailed it, essentially, whether you've picked the right topic and whether you're in the right place. So again, it's tempting to think that you have to have a presence on all of these platforms, but that actually might come at the cost of diluting your positioning and ultimately your brand. Next slide. Okay, great. So this slide's a little bit heady. I'm just going to kind of take a few moments to run through what we're talking about here. So this is getting deeper into selecting topics and selecting the type of content that resonate with your brand. So whether you're looking at it from a lens of this is your brand and here are your goals, or whether you're looking at it from a lens of this is your customer or this is the audience and this is the phase through their marketing journey, the same approach applies. And I don't know if any of you have had any kind of classical marketing training, but these should look familiar to you. They're both different versions of the marketing funnel. And so your content marketing can also be thought of as having its own funnel. It has different phases that line up to the different steps in or phases during this funnel. So at the topmost of your content strategy, you have broad marketing objectives, which might be things like producing content to garner brand awareness. If you're a young company and you haven't really started any sort of presence online, or if you are trying to reach a B2C market, you're basically trying to appeal to the broad population, and you're trying to create content that's both appealing to new people and that is calling their attention for the first time. So you're going to be thinking of it as brand awareness type marketing. Later, once you've gotten a stronghold in that space, once you've started to think about resonance with your customer or with your audience, you can start to develop thought leadership type content that underscores your position, why you're doing what you're doing, talks about some of the unique features or benefits that your product offers, or that makes big claims about the industry or about the problem that you're solving. So those are typically quote unquote thought leadership type posts. Later, you can start to look at engagement and conversion. So once you've gotten your name out there, once people are aware of what you're offering and you've got sufficient traffic to your site, then you can start to think about how can you convert them. So earlier I mentioned maybe you're looking at a case where somebody's reading a white paper or reading a deck that they on an airplane that they got from your website. That's about, if you're looking at your funnel, you're trying to drive traffic from a high level and attract them through basic brand awareness, and then thought leadership content that helps generate awareness and resonance. And then you're starting to offer them something deeper, so a way to engage and convert. And convert can be a download, it can be a sign up for a newsletter, or it can actually be a purchase. So this is important, I think, to think about, just kind of a side note here. And I'll send the slide along, so don't worry about trying to make sense of it all right now. But the idea here, again, that we're trying to underscore is, the right topics and the right types of content are the ones that line up with your brand goals. So, if we were to think more deeply about this, it's easy to get seduced by an agency to make a video for YouTube. But if you're really focused on lead gen, if you're if your efforts are around this middle part of the funnel, it actually might not be the right move. Or it's tempting to be lured in by influencers, but maybe there's not quite a brand fit, or maybe they're not able to help you convert if your goal is sheer conversion. So this is, I think, a good thing to think through before you start your content strategy. And again, to start processing what your objectives are and lining that up with the content you're producing and distributing on each channel. Next slide, please. So going a little bit deeper, let's look at this. So at the top of the funnel, you've got things like potentially an article series or blog posts. You've got videos, social posts, and distribution. And social is partly, social can be a really great way to drive traffic. SEO can also be a great way to drive traffic. Offline marketing and event sponsorship. So these are ways that somebody would potentially, who's at the top of the funnel, become aware of your brand offering on a first basis. Middle of the funnel activities might be doing webinars, branded content. You can work with a branded content studio. You can create co-branded guides. You can develop partner content. You can create other content with an aim to be shared. And there are many different ways that you can facilitate that sharing. You can also sign up for guest speaking opportunities. And the middle of the funnel objectives, again, related to thought leadership and engagement, mean that your opportunity is to, they're aware of you, you've gotten in front of them, potentially their interest is piqued, and this is your opportunity to start to get a little bit more detailed and offer them something of real value. And I highly recommend partnerships at this stage if that's where you are. If your goal is right here in this middle of the funnel, partnerships can be a phenomenal way of getting some traction there. And finally, the bottom of the funnel, which is some of the tactics that you might employ there are advertising. A lot of people do paid search, kind of dying a little bit, but landing pages with strong sales driving copy are always the right thing to do. Product demos, free trials, and all of your posts, of course, should have some sort of call to action. So I want to actually address a question that came through. Somebody had asked a question about B2B marketing and whether it makes sense to have a content marketing strategy if you're going after elephants instead of rabbits. So my answer here is absolutely yes. Any smart business decision maker is going to check you out online before engaging with you. And they're going to look for things like accolades or awards, press mentions, customer testimonials, and they may even check out your social following and blog posts as a proxy for how well known you are and basically how much you have your game together. So absolutely, it's good to have a content strategy, not just to raise awareness in a B2C play, but really to validate what you're offering, even if it's in a very targeted kind of context. Not only that, but once you actually start making videos and start writing blog posts or white papers, you can send your prospects links to this content in an email as a conversation starter, or you can seed your website with these. You can seed your social properties with this, and they become lead gen material. So definitely, I would say go through the trouble of producing them. I'm a huge fan of produce once, publish 5 times. So once you've already developed the content, start looking for ways that you can parcel it out into other channels and other platforms. For example, one thing I did recently in this vein is that I wrote a blog post called Why You Need an Interim CMO, which several of my clients and prospects have read. Then I took an excerpt and built that into the interim CMO proposal deck to underscore our value proposition. Then I took other fragments from it and published it, at least 20 times on social media with a link to the blog post. And from there it becomes kind of an ongoing machine that you can just reuse several different times. So I'd say definitely go through the trouble of making a video. Have somebody write you up a series of blog posts, and then spend the rest of your time thinking about how to reuse that. And more likely than not, that content can actually be funneled into different stages and different, it can line up with your funnel in different ways. So if it's top of the funnel, it's a blog series. If it's, like I mentioned before, mid-funnel where you've got a little bit more of a hook, you can start to piece out really key components of that blog post and send to them in a different packaging. And there's another talk that I give that's solely focused on repackaging and repurposing content, because I feel so passionately about that. Especially if your company is young and you don't have a ton of resources to develop content, start looking for ways to swap in a different headline, change the image, even write a secondary post about your audience's reaction to the first post that you made. All these are ways to kind of increase leverage for your content and save you time and resources. So next slide, please.
Megan, we have a quick question, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Beyonce would like to know a little bit more about paid search. Did you mean Google AdWords when you talk about paid search, or is it something else?
Google AdWords, yep. Okay. Is there more of a question there? Or okay, great. Yeah, it's still, I think, it's definitely useful for many types of companies. I think it's an area where you have to really pay a lot of attention to your spend. It's easy to sink a lot of money in there and not get a great return. But, it's really specific to, e-commerce sites can do really well with paid search. Other people that are trying to convert on the spot, still leverage it. But I think if you're going for more of a top of funnel play with brand awareness, or people don't know your service or product, or if you're trying to really go for longer term equity, or if your product has a really heavy content play, it's definitely declining in use for those types of companies. Okay, so next slide, please. So the next step, of course, is to produce your content. So all content marketing needs content, of course, whether it's a case study, whether it's a video, it's an article, and let's jump into how to do that. When you're thinking about how you're going to get your content marketing built, you have a few options. You can do it in-house. In-house can be very costly. It can cost you a lot of time. It's also, if you have an early team, your company is constantly trying to make decisions how to spend its time. So if you're taking away time from your marketers to actually write blog posts, then it's not used for other productive things. The alternative to that is to work with an agency or a branded content studio, and they are definitely experts in their arena, but it's probably going to cost you a lot of money. So in-house costs you a lot of time, agencies cost you a lot of money. You can also outsource it. Outsourcing is, it's a term that, I don't know, it just gives me chills thinking about it. Outsourcing can produce a ton of terrible results and waste a lot of time for your team. And outsourcing in itself is kind of an art. You have to have things very clearly laid out. Typically, it takes a lot of time to communicate, especially if you're working with people across time zones, and be prepared to redo multiple times. I generally don't recommend outsourced if you can avoid it. And the last option, of course, is that you can work with InterimCMO. We have a ton of content that's worth checking out about how to do this, but we can also execute on your content for you. Finally, step 5, priming and publishing. So this again, kind of moves beyond Content 101 and gets into Content Marketing 201. First and foremost, you want to have an author team member assigned to the content. So if you are working with an outsourced team, you definitely want to have someone who's taking the lead and following that process the whole time. And then once that's actually produced, I recommend starting with a couple different article headlines and several different social headlines. And again, the reason is that I would actually love to see if you want to chat into the box in the panel in the right-hand column, who has posted a blog post and waited and seen like 10 page views. Nobody ever arrives. Maybe you've tweeted it out once or twice, and after you've spent a lot of time and money, it just kind of sits there and you think, well, that was really crappy, didn't do anything. Does anyone have that experience? A couple people, okay. So typically we have this belief that once we invest in producing a blog post or making a video, that the hard work is over and we just sort of publish it and then wait for the traffic to roll in. That's really not the case. In fact, you need to, my kind of big claim is the more organized you are ahead of time and the more times you publish it, the more of a result that you'll get, the more return you'll get. So each article should have 2 to 3 different headlines and several different social headlines, because you're actually going to be publishing this multiple times, not just once, but you're going to be dropping it into Buffer. You're going to be sharing it through several different team members, ideally. You're going to be retweeting each other's posts. You're going to be swapping in different images and potentially reposting on different platforms. And again, this goes to this idea of, build it once and spend the rest of your time driving traffic to it. So when you have article headlines and your social headlines already planned out in advance, then you don't have to think about that. So when you produce it, go ahead and go through the work of writing those out so that you have them handy. Start thinking about the hashtags and the keywords you're going to use. I recommend doing your research before you finish the post. That's also so that you can start to stuff your keywords into your content in a really relevant way. Maybe you find that there are some terms that are more powerful from an SEO perspective, and you decide to weave those in. Maybe you find the same thing with social hashtags, that before you publish them, it's worth having that, having that pile of terms on hand that you can use. And then certainly go ahead and plug in your UTM code or build a link tracker, because that's what's going to allow you to get meaningful analytics off of it. And then finally, I would say go ahead and, before you publish, have multiple images on hand. And so this is the idea of creating everything in advance that you might need to help you kind of put the rest on autopilot. So again, with the mindset of doing a little bit of work up front, that will help you in the future. Next slide, please. And the best way to organize this, of course, is through a content calendar. So if you're not preparing for, and if you're not scheduling every piece of content, you're actually handicapping it. So again, I recommend building, and I can send you this after the webinar, a really detailed content calendar that helps everyone in your team know exactly when which post is going out on which channels. It helps them stay attuned to where they can repost or share their article. It also helps you coordinate your content around your product offering. Maybe you have some new features that are being released. Maybe you have an app update. Maybe you have your first product launch, or maybe you have a big event that you're driving towards. Your content strategy should absolutely line up with your other company goals, and a content calendar is the perfect way to help make sure that that's in sync. Next slide, please. So now that you have produced the content and you've done a lot of thinking about where it's going to go, what kind of channels it's going to live on, what keywords you're going to use, what social headlines and images you're going to incorporate, the next step is to distribute and leverage it. So as I mentioned before, this is actually the most effective thing you can do with your content. So put at least twice as much thought into how you're going to distribute it and promote it. Producing it then, even though it feels to many startups like that's the biggest hurdle, producing it is actually the easy part. It's really distributing it and starting to drive eyeballs to it. That's the hard part. Especially if you're young, you probably have a really tiny social following, and that's not really helpful when you're trying to drive traffic to your content. So let's jump to the next slide. I want you to start thinking about where you can find your passionate communities. If you remember at the beginning, we went through all that work of talking about Persona 1, Persona 2, Persona 3. These are actually really great. Even if you're not targeting these personas, they're really great to start thinking about which communities exist online that you can start to tap into to promote your content and to share it. You can leverage email lists, your Medium publication, your social networks, and also your partner networks, potentially your advisors or investors networks if they're willing to share. And next slide, please. More importantly, start thinking really strategically about what happens to your content once it's there. So don't just publish it and let it lie. Get really active and start thinking about this concept of content leveraging. Content leveraging is a term that I made up about getting as much as possible from your content after it's published. So, tag people, quote people, mention people, reach out to others in the industry who might know people that could share your posts, especially if it's really high quality content. They're typically happy to share. One comment on this, if you are stressed out or overwhelmed creating content, you can know that many others are in the same boat and would be more than happy to have other content that's high quality to share. So if you start thinking about it through that lens, there are a lot of people you can find that would potentially love to do a content partnership with you or content trade. Syndicating is something that even the major publications use. A lot of the newspapers don't even write their own content on the weekend. They actually just repost other newspapers' articles. And that type of approach is really, really great for content marketing too, because it alleviates the burden of you having to produce everything. And it also starts to get, if you're doing, a one-for-one trade, it also starts to get your content in front of a new audience. So really highly recommend that. If you've written good content, you can also look for industry newsletters. That's another thing. Industry newsletter managers are constantly looking for high quality blog posts and videos to include in their mailers. And in some cases, there's even kind of a sponsorship opportunity there. Definitely a really great way to get in front of a new audience and to start to leverage other people's followers. The other thing here that I think is worth talking about is engaging people who've interacted with your content before. So if you have published something and you get a whole bunch of retweets or comments, find a way. There are plenty of tools out there that can help you capture this information, or you can do it manually, but find a way to grab the names or the handles of the people who are commenting and sharing your content and reach out to them the next time. If they thought it was interesting the first time, it follows that next time you post something, they might also be interested in engaging again. So this was actually something that we did quite frequently at VentureBeat. We'd reach out to people who had previously shared some of our articles on that topic and would say, hey, at Mention, noticed you shared this post before. I thought you might like our next article on X topic. Extremely, extremely effective. You might, every once in a while you'll get somebody who kind of comes back disgruntled, doesn't like the direct message, but more often than not, they're you're doing them a favor, helping them weave through the massive content and all the noise on social. So definitely give it a shot. Worst thing that can happen is, they unfollow you. So and again, it can be extremely effective. Mentioned this before, but looking for opportunities to syndicate your content. Posting in groups and forums. This is a really great strategy. It's definitely time consuming. So unless you're very, very targeted and your group gets a ton of engagement, I would say wait until phase 2 of your content marketing strategy, or wait until some of the other kinks have been worked out. If you have somebody who is an intern or junior marketer on your team and who loves direct outreach and is great at keeping digital conversations going, that could be a really great thing to allocate to them. Definitely being mindful of not spamming with links, but if you're able to really follow conversations and add value and relevant commentary, that can be extremely effective. Tapping influencers, doing co-promoted content, definitely handle with care. My bias here is generally towards syndication and kind of content trades as opposed to tapping real influencers. The influencer marketing space has definitely gotten pretty bloated, and it can be quite expensive to engage an influencer. Also, it runs the risk of seeming really disingenuine. So, again, I favor content syndication type engagements. Comments on threads, and then of course you can do paid distribution or boosts. So these are all the types of things, and I'm sure there are 20 other things that I didn't list here, but these are the types of things that I personally like to leverage most frequently. They're things I recommend for the startups that we work with, and even if you just pick one of these, I promise you'll get a lot more lift for your content. Next slide, please.
We have a couple questions, if you don't mind going through that quickly.
Yeah, absolutely.
We would like to know how much of this is unique to B2C versus B2B companies.
Any of these, I think, can be used for either. If you have a B2B play, it's probably more valuable to start engaging more one-on-one, but to go to places where your thought leaders are actually, living, engaging, spending time online. So posting in groups or forums might be more relevant for B2B, or reaching out to industry insiders, even kind of cold content marketing tactics. Maybe you're doing a cold email campaign, but inside that you're linking to a stellar blog post that you created or a really nicely produced video. Those types of tactics can be really great for B2B. They're just a little bit more targeted. The other thing, like I mentioned before, is I do think it's worth having a certain, seeding your social channels with the type of content that's going to be appealing to your B2B leads. So even though you're not going for masses, you're going for very targeted viewers, they will still probably go check you out online. They'll still probably go visit your site. They might look at your social profiles. And you definitely want to have things there that show that you're a thought leader in your space, and that show that you are engaging in their industry, that show that you have a strong point of view. So I think it's really good for brand building. It's definitely harder to approach a lead. It's definitely harder to approach somebody in a B2B capacity if you don't have your other kind of ducks in a row. So so that's I would say think of the things here that are more strategic, and use your intuition on what kinds of things resonate in your industry. If nobody in the B2B space in your industry is tagging people or quoting people, that actually might be a really interesting thing to try, just to do something kind of different. Mentioning other people's followers, that can be, I would be, again, strategic about that. If you think that you have a piece of content that's valuable to them, that tactic could definitely work for B2B. So I think it's all about how you angle each one of these. Again, definitely, B2B is a lot more targeted, but in any case, you're going to be focused on brand building at some point in your life cycle. So, you still need to focus on having a fellowship. You still need to focus on having a point of view, having something interesting to say. And the more that you can reflect that through your content marketing, the more valuable that is.
Okay, the other
Is there another question?
From Christina, and she was asking, do you have any sample personas or templates that you can share?
I do. I will absolutely send it to you afterwards.
Great. Okay, moving on to the next.
Yeah. Cool. And I just one other comment about that. I think it's good to, like I said before, go through that exercise at the beginning before you start, and then keep that on hand so that people in your company, as your marketing team grows, that becomes sort of a source of truth. But it's definitely worth reevaluating every 6 months or so, because your target audience might change, your target customer might change, your product might pivot. There are a lot of different, or you might have, garnered enough of a following and active community in persona 1, and then it's worth kind of moving into persona 2 and persona 3. Or maybe your company has both a B2B arm and a B2C arm. You're going to focus on one persona first, and then after 6 months or a year, you're going to move and start producing content that's appealing to that second community. So definitely, keep those inside your company as that kind of, intellectual property, but also that, that guidepost that everyone can rally around. Next step, measure and learn. Probably more than anything, your company has thought a lot about what metrics are meaningful. You've got customer metrics. If you have a robust sales team, they're absolutely tracking things like customer satisfaction, maybe time to close or time to resolution, probably looking at lifetime value, profitability. Those are absolutely metrics that are probably familiar into your company. Same with other financial, logistical, and retention metrics. Those are all super valuable, and you probably thought a lot about those, but probably you haven't thought a lot about the next slide, which is tracking. Next slide, please. Awesome, thanks. Tracking the benefit of the content that you're producing and seeing how it stacks up. So you've got awareness metrics, engagement metrics, and conversion metrics. Again, you're going to get the slide deck afterwards, so I'm not going to go through all of these. But when you start to understand the metrics that matter, you can evaluate whether your content is performant. And if you're a content marketing manager at your company, more likely than not, you've gotten some sort of pushback from somebody that says, "Hey, well, how do I know that social media is really effective? Hey, tell me how, please, 8 blog posts is going to, radically improve our sales." And if you start to have these metrics developed, and if you're looking at things from a traffic perspective, from an engagement perspective, and from a registrations or referrals or conversion perspective, then you're armed with the data that you need to say, hey, well, 8 webinars, or 8 blog posts may not have driven any new customers, but it has garnered a lot of attention, and we were able to find resonance around this topic. And so we think that there's this opportunity for us to carve out more of a voice in this industry and use that long term to build real value and real site equity. Next slide, please. Okay, cool. So wrapping up here, the 4 things to think about moving forward are, first mapping out your personas, identifying the right channels to be on, then start thinking about the types of content you're going to produce and the topics. Definitely make sure that these things are thought out ahead of time in order to save you money and time, because if you're just kind of blindly launching into your content strategy, then you're not really getting the most bang for your buck. So do please, even though it feels like a barrier to immediately, getting it done, just take even a 2-hour session with your team, do some brainstorming around these things. Once you have it, it will guide the rest of the decisions that you make around content marketing. Then figure out how you're going to produce your content, who on your team is going to do it, whether it's one person. Definitely at least one person should own the end product, if not, do the production in-house. Figure out if you're going to use outsource help or if you're going to tap an agency. Make a content calendar, and then in that content calendar, logically map out each of the topics that you're going to produce, when, and how you're going to distribute them. Especially think about content syndications. I kind of flagged that for you. And then reach out to me if you need help. I'm going to send you a couple templates afterwards. You'll get these slides. I'll send you something that will help you think about the content personas process. And ping me, send me an email if you have any questions, or if there's something that your team is kind of struggling with. So with that, I'll say thank you, and I will open it up to questions if anybody wants to go a little bit deeper in any of these areas. Questions. B2B, B2C, B2B2C, marketplace.
One from Samantha, and she is asking if you have a favorite or examples of a content calendar format.
Yeah, there have been a couple tools in the last few years that have sprouted up to manage content calendars, and I personally find a lot of those too robust. Most small teams don't really need that. My favorite thing actually is simply a Google spreadsheet. So Google spreadsheet with potentially kind of laid out in calendar format, and then you can do like days of the week or dates on the horizontal axis, and then the vertical axis has your content topic, and then maybe you've gone through and checked off the number of times that you're going to post it and indicated which channels. And then the other thing, which is really helpful, is to have maybe like a second tab of the spreadsheet that goes ahead and maps out all the different article headlines and social headlines that you plan to use for each post. That's actually the simplest, most efficient thing that I've seen, especially with small companies. Otherwise, they have to learn a new tool, and they have to, sometimes they get bogged down managing that software. Sometimes it's also an expense that's not justified in the early stages. So I think even just a simple Google spreadsheet, as long as you know, and actually your whole team has visibility into which content you're producing when and where you're promoting it, that's the most important thing.
Okay, our next question is from Krissa, and she'd like to know, how do you adapt to different industries, understanding their markets, challenges, etc., when assisting them with content creation and distribution?
So that's a really great question. I sort of think I've thought about this a lot before. There are a lot of principles that apply across any industry. It's sort of like, a doctor is looking at every patient with, a unique physiology and a unique set of needs. But there are also some universal truths that emerge, like, a doctor might tell everyone, make sure you stay hydrated, make sure you're resting well, get some exercise a few times a week, eat a lot of vegetables. Like, there might be some kind of fundamentals that apply to everyone across the board. And I think that's the same with content marketing. Earlier we talked a lot about the funnel and what stage you are in the funnel, and making sure that your content lines up with what your goals are and where your customers are on that journey. And that's definitely valid. But there are still some fundamentals that every company should be doing. And so from that perspective, it makes it easier to jump into different industries and to evaluate the problems that different clients are having, because they still need to be thinking about brand awareness. They still need to be thinking about how they're converting off their content. And so they're, in addition to their unique case, there's also this sort of baseline fundamental system of truth that they can be leveraging, and they can be operating off of. And so I guess me specifically, I've had I've done consulting for several years, and so it becomes this very familiar thing to every 3 to 6 months dive into a new company, a new industry, hardware, IoT, fintech, SaaS. It becomes very familiar, and it gets to be easier over time. But I guess I think probably the same is for you too. So if you've had another role at a different company, potentially in a different industry where you were in charge of marketing or running some piece of content marketing, you started to get really good at certain areas, and then some of those things you can apply to your new company, and some of it's testing and learning. So that that's the other piece of it, is definitely staying close, staying in touch with the performance metrics and using those to validate whether your guesses were right, or understand where you need to improve.
So we had one more question about the calendar. Bianca was wondering, I believe you said you were going to, if you could include a screenshot or an example of the calendar when we follow up after the webinar.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great.
So we're sending out slides. I'll also share an example of a content calendar. And then the third thing is a personas exercise.
Perfect. The next question is from Martin, and he was wondering, can you explain more about the procedure to get the right tone of voice?
Yeah, that's interesting. That's a great question, and that's something that we didn't talk a lot about here. I guess if you can, Martin, I'd be curious to know if your company has already done any work around identifying what your brand voice is. That's really the core. A lot of companies, sorry?
He said no, just to jump in really quick.
No. Okay. So yeah, that's an interesting question. The first thing that I recommend is figuring out who you are as a company, and that's actually a really big part of the things that InterimCMO helps out with, as well as what is our identity, what's our positioning. I think it's worth building a kind of brand and communications guide for your team, even if it's something that's a page long to start with, and then later you kind of build on that. But you've got a company voice, and that voice represents who you are, what your identity is, what you stand for, the industry you're in, the kind of product you're creating, and then you've got maybe your kind of marketing voice, which should be, it may not be identical to that. It should be compatible with that. So, maybe you've gone through the work of determining your values or your company mission, and those tend to be a little bit more formal or serious or intense or passionate. And maybe that's not the right tone of voice to use on social, or maybe that's not the right tone of voice to use in a video or in a blog post. But theoretically, those voices are resonant or compatible. So I do think that can be tricky if a company hasn't gone through the work of figuring out who they are first. You can definitely experiment, but I do recommend once you get out there and start posting things, if you're carefully looking at the metrics and trying to understand what content's really resonating, track those in a document and start to use that to learn from. A lot of startups will, bring in outsourced help for content marketing, or bring in junior interns, or people who don't have a lot of experience with marketing, and so they may just start posting things in the tone of voice that they use to speak every day, and that may or may not really be resonant, especially if you have more corporate clients, or you're trying to develop partnerships that are positioning yourself in a really specific light. that tone of voice actually might not really work. So I think it's worth taking some time as a company to figure out who you are, and then testing and learning what tone of voice resonates in your content marketing. And ideally, they should, there should be some overlap. They should be harmonious or compatible. And so, sorry, just to add to that, are you fun and playful? Is it appropriate for your social team to be making jokes on social? Sometimes it works really well, and sometimes there's really good fit with that voice and what your brand stands for, and sometimes it's at odds. So that's what I recommend from a process perspective.
Great. That looks like that is our last question. So I just want to thank everybody for joining. Megan, do you want to say anything just to conclude and wrap things up?
Just thank you so much for having me. It was really awesome to work with you, and early growth is definitely a great resource for startups. We've done a lot of really great content partnerships, and I think there's a great opportunity to work with either one of us. And thank you for everyone who joined, and please definitely reach out. My email's on the slide. I'll send you a couple resources as follow-ups, and if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch.
Thanks, everyone. We'll send you those resources and the recording as well. Thanks again. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.